Eleanor Martin clutched her worn leather music case as she stepped off the bus into the bright morning sunlight. The grand stone building of the Westfield Music Hall loomed before her, its windows gleaming. Her stomach tightened with a mixture of hope and dread. After 20 years of teaching piano to neighborhood children, she was finally here, a contestant in the Westfield Music Festival, one of the most prestigious events in the country. She smoothed down her simple blue dress, bought specially for this occasion from the department store back home. Around her, other musicians arrived in sleek cars wearing designer clothes and carrying expensive instrument cases. Many greeted each other with familiar embraces and air kisses. They belonged here. Eleanor, at 42, felt like an imposter. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, touching the small photograph tucked into her case. Her mother, smiling from her garden 5 summers ago before the illness took her. "This one's for you." The registration area buzzed with activity. Young prodigies sat with perfect posture, their parents hovering nearby. Established musicians chatted confidently with event staff. Eleanor joined the line, watching as each person ahead of her was greeted with enthusiasm by the coordinator, a tall woman with sleek silver hair and an elegant black pantsuit. "Next, please." Eleanor stepped forward, placing her application on the desk. "Good morning, Eleanor Martin, for the piano competition." The coordinator barely glanced up, scanning the paper with quick efficiency. Her eyebrows rose slightly as she noted Eleanor's age and background. Teaching piano in a small town in Ohio. No conservatory training, no previous competition experience. "You're aware this is an international competition?" The woman's tone was polite but cool. Eleanor nodded. "Yes, I understand. Your performance slot will be—" The coordinator checked her tablet. 4:45 p.m., the final slot of the day. She handed Eleanor a contestant badge without meeting her eyes. The judges prefer to hear the more established musicians earlier, when they're fresh. In other words, Eleanor thought, when anyone who matters is still around to listen. "Thank you," she said quietly, pinning the badge to her dress. "The waiting area is down that hallway. Good luck." The dismissal was clear as the coordinator turned her beaming smile to the next contestant, a young man with a violin case who was apparently someone she recognized. "Thomas, wonderful to see you again. Everyone's talking about your Berlin performance." Eleanor slipped away, following signs to the waiting area. The hallway walls were lined with photographs of past winners, their faces confident and glowing. None of them looked like her, a middle-aged woman from nowhere special, with hands that showed signs of years spent gardening and raising other people's musical talents rather than her own. The waiting room was elegant, all polished, wood and velvet seating, but tense with nervous energy. Musicians practiced silently, fingers moving through the air above imaginary instruments. Others buried themselves in scores, making last-minute notations. A few spoke in hushed tones about judges, previous competitions, mutual acquaintances from famous orchestras and music schools. Eleanor found an empty chair in the corner and opened her case. Inside lay her music sheets, not some famous concerto or sonata, but her own composition. 20 pages of notes that had poured from her heart during the long nights after her mother's passing. 20 pages that nobody had ever heard except her. A young woman with a flute sat down beside her. "First time at Westfield?" she asked kindly, noticing Eleanor's expression. Eleanor nodded. "Is it that obvious?" The woman laughed. "Only a little. I'm Lily. This is my 3rd time trying." Eleanor. "Nice to meet you. 3rd time. So it's very difficult to place?" Lily's eyes widened. "Nearly impossible. Last year, over 200 musicians competed for 3 spots in the winner's showcase. And the showcase is everything: conductors, recording labels, tour managers. They all come to discover new talent." "Oh." Eleanor felt her confidence shrinking further. "I didn't realize—" "What are you playing?" Lily asked. "Something I wrote myself," Eleanor admitted. Lily looked surprised. "Really? That's brave. Most people stick to the classics. The judges tend to prefer pieces they can compare directly to other performances they've heard." A staff member appeared at the doorway. "Attention, contestants. The performance schedule is now posted. Please note your exact time and be ready 15 minutes early. The first performer begins in 30 minutes. People rushed to check the list. Eleanor waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. Running her finger down the page, she found her name at the very bottom. Last performer of the day, just as the coordinator had said. When she returned to her seat, Lily was gone, already preparing for her much earlier slot. Eleanor sat alone, watching as contestants were called one by one. Some returned looking relieved, others fighting back tears. The room gradually emptied as the day wore on. At 3, Eleanor decided to find the practice room she'd been assigned. Following her map through the maze-like building, she eventually located a small room with a decent upright piano, not the grand piano she would perform on, but good enough to warm up her fingers. She began with simple scales, feeling the familiar comfort of the keys beneath her fingers. Gradually, she transitioned to snippets of her composition, stopping frequently to adjust her approach. The piece demanded emotional honesty above technical showiness, a risk in a competition like this, but the only true way to play it. A knock interrupted her. A harried-looking staff member poked his head in. "Excuse me, are you using this room for much longer? We have some VIP contestants who need additional practice space." Eleanor gathered her music quickly. "No, I'm finished. Thank you." As she left, she passed 2 young men in expensive suits being ushered into the room. One was complaining loudly about the quality of the piano. By 4:30, the waiting area had nearly emptied. Only Eleanor and 2 other musicians remained, all with late slots that nobody wanted. One nervously chewed his fingernails while the other paced, muttering passages under her breath. The staff member appeared again. "Rodney Chen, you're up next." The nail-biter grabbed his cello and followed, leaving Eleanor with the pacer, who seemed too absorbed in her own world to notice anyone else. Eleanor checked her watch. Almost her turn. She should feel terrified, but instead a strange calm had settled over her. What did she really have to lose? No one expected anything from her. No critics waited to analyze her performance. No fans would be disappointed. The freedom of being overlooked gave her an unexpected gift. She could simply play her truth. At precisely 4:40, the staff member returned. "Next performer in 5 minutes." The pacing woman gathered her violin and left. "That's me next," Eleanor said. The young man nodded distractedly, checking something on his clipboard. "Right, Eleanor. Martin, piano? Yes, you're our last performer today. The judges are running on schedule, so you'll be called in exactly 5 minutes. Wait by the stage door, please." Eleanor gathered her music and case, following him to a small holding area beside the main stage. Through the crack in the door, she could see into the grand hall. The magnificent space, which could seat nearly 1,000 people, was almost empty. A few scattered audience members remained, mostly friends or family of other performers. In the front row sat 3 judges, their expressions neutral and professional. At the side of the stage stood the conductor, Alessandro Rossi, a legend in the classical music world. He was checking his watch and speaking with an assistant, looking like he had somewhere much more important to be. The woman with the violin finished her piece to polite applause. As she exited, she passed Eleanor without a glance, her face tight with disappointment. "Eleanor Martin," called the stage manager. "You're on." Eleanor took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The spotlight felt warm on her face as she walked to the gleaming grand piano. She placed her music on the stand, adjusted the bench, and looked out at the nearly empty hall. The judges glanced up briefly, pens poised over their evaluation sheets. Alessandro Rossi had taken a seat, his posture suggesting he was simply waiting for this final obligation to end. No one expected anything remarkable. No one was really even listening. Eleanor placed her fingers on the keys and closed her eyes. In that moment, she wasn't playing for them anymore. She was playing for herself, for her mother, for every dream she'd set aside, for every student whose hands she'd guided over the years. And then she began to play. As Eleanor's fingers hovered over the keys, time seemed to slow. The nearly empty concert hall faded away, and her mind drifted back to where her journey had begun. So many years ago, she was 7 years old again, sitting at the old upright piano in her grandparents' living room. The piano had been her grandmother's prized possession, bought second-hand during better times. Its ivory keys were yellowed with age, some chipped at the edges, but to little Eleanor, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Play it again, sweetheart," her mother would say, sitting in the worn armchair by the window, mending clothes after a long day at the diner where she worked. "You make it sound like raindrops dancing." Eleanor's family had never had much money. Her father left when she was 4. disappearing without a trace and leaving her mother to raise her alone in their small Ohio town. But what they lacked in wealth, they made up for in love for music. Her mother sang while she cooked, hummed while she cleaned, and saved every spare penny for Eleanor's weekly piano lessons with Mrs. Sullivan, the retired music teacher who lived 3 streets over. That child has a gift, Mrs. Sullivan had told Eleanor's mother after 6 months of lessons. She doesn't just play the notes. She feels them. I've taught for 40 years, and I've only seen this kind of natural talent a handful of times. By 12, Eleanor was playing pieces that most adults struggled with. When she was 13, Mrs. Sullivan arranged for her to perform at the county fair. Eleanor still remembered the scratchy blue dress her mother had sewn for the occasion, the butterflies in her stomach as she walked onto the makeshift stage, the amazed faces in the small crowd as her small hands brought Chopin to life. After the performance, a tall man in an expensive suit had approached them. He introduced himself as a professor from the State University's music department. "Your daughter has extraordinary potential," he told Eleanor's mother. "With proper training, she could have a real future in music. We have a special program for gifted young musicians. Scholarships are available." For weeks afterward, Eleanor and her mother had talked excitedly about the possibility. They requested brochures, filled out applications, dreamed about what could be. Eleanor practiced harder than ever, imagining herself in grand concert halls, traveling the world, making her mother proud. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Eleanor's grandmother had suffered a severe stroke. She would need constant care. Eleanor's mother was the only family member who could provide it. "We'll move in with Grandma," her mother had explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's only 2 hours away. We can find you a new piano teacher there." But the small town they moved to had no piano teachers. The nearest was 45 minutes away, and with her mother working extra shifts to cover medical bills, there was no time for lessons. The special program application was tucked away in a drawer, eventually forgotten. Their new home had no space for the upright piano. It was sold along with many other possessions to help with expenses. Eleanor practiced when she could on the out-of-tune piano at the local church, but between helping care for her grandmother and picking up odd jobs to contribute to the household, those moments grew fewer and farther between. Her grandmother passed away 3 years later, but by then Eleanor was 16 and their finances were stretched thin. College seemed impossible without significant scholarships, and the momentum of her early musical education had been lost. When her high school music teacher suggested she apply to music schools anyway, Eleanor had simply shaken her head. "That dream is over," she'd said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I need to be practical now." She took a job as a receptionist at a local doctor's office after graduation. The work was steady, the pay decent enough. She dated a few boys from town, none seriously. Music became something she enjoyed in private, playing on a small keyboard she bought with her first paycheck. Sometimes she would compose little melodies, recording them on an old cassette player, but never sharing them with anyone. Years passed. Eleanor's mother developed arthritis, making it harder for her to work. At 24, Eleanor moved them to a slightly larger town where she had found a better-paying job as an administrative assistant. Their new apartment happened to be across the street from a music store that offered piano lessons. One day, gathering her courage, Eleanor walked in and asked if they needed another teacher. "Do you have a degree in music?" the owner had asked skeptically. "No," Eleanor admitted, "but I can play." She sat at one of the display pianos and played a Beethoven sonata from memory, then a piece by Debussy. When she finished, the store was silent. 2 customers had stopped browsing to listen. The owner, a heavy-set man with kind eyes, nodded slowly. "You start Monday," he said. 4 students to begin with. We'll see how it goes." Teaching rekindled something in Eleanor. Each time she guided small hands over the keys, each time she saw the light of understanding in a child's eyes, she felt a piece of herself come back to life. Her students won local competitions. Parents requested her specifically. Eventually, she saved enough to buy a decent upright piano for their apartment. At night, after her mother had gone to bed, Eleanor would sit at her piano in the darkness and compose. Her music had changed over the years. Deeper, more complex, filled with the quiet pain of abandoned dreams, but also with unexpected moments of joy. She filled notebook after notebook with compositions no one ever heard. When Eleanor turned 35, her mother was diagnosed with cancer. The next 5 years became a blur of hospital visits, medications, brief remissions followed by devastating returns. Through it all, Eleanor taught her students, cared for her mother, and played her private compositions in the dark. 3 months ago, her mother had a good day, one of her last. Eleanor had been playing a new piece, something that had come to her during a sleepless night of worry. "That's beautiful," her mother said from the doorway of the living room, leaning on her walker. "What's it called?" Eleanor stopped playing, startled. "It doesn't have a name. It's just something I'm working on." Her mother made her way slowly to the couch and sat down. "Play it again. All of it." Eleanor played the complete piece, nearly 15 minutes of music that flowed from serene melancholy to cautious hope, and back again. When she finished, she turned to find her mother crying silently. "You need to share this," her mother said firmly. "The world should hear what you can do." "Mom, I'm 42. Professional musicians start when they're children. It's too late for me. Promise me something," her mother said, her voice suddenly urgent. "Promise me you'll try just once. Enter one competition. Play your music for someone besides me." 2 weeks later, her mother was gone. While sorting through her things, Eleanor found a newspaper clipping about the Westfield Music Festival. On it, in her mother's shaky handwriting, this one, "Promise me." The memory of that moment snapped Eleanor back to the present, to the grand piano waiting for her on the empty stage. The judges were checking their watches. The conductor, Alessandro Rossi, was reviewing notes for tomorrow's performances. No one expected anything from the plain, middle-aged woman who had been given the last slot of the day. Eleanor took a deep breath. "This one's for you, Mom," she whispered. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play her composition. "Memories of Daylight." The piece began softly, tentatively, like early morning light filtering through curtains. Each note was a memory, of childhood dreams, of her mother's unwavering belief, of years spent nurturing other people's talents while her own lay dormant. The music built slowly, gaining complexity and confidence. Her hands moved with certainty now, bringing to life 20 years of unplayed melodies, of unspoken emotions. This wasn't just a piece of music. It was her life story. Every setback, every sacrifice, every small joy, all of it flowed from her fingers into the magnificent piano, filling the nearly empty hall with something entirely unexpected. Eleanor closed her eyes, lost completely in her creation. She didn't notice when Alessandro Rossi looked up from his notes, his brow furrowed in confusion. She didn't see when one of the judges set down his pen. She didn't hear when the door at the back of the hall opened and several people who had been leaving stopped and turned back. In this moment, for the first time in decades, Eleanor Martin was exactly who she was meant to be. The grand hall of the Westfield Music Center had been full of life earlier in the day. Hundreds of seats packed with music lovers, critics with notepads, talent scouts looking for the next big star. Famous musicians had played on this very stage to thunderous applause. Important handshakes had been exchanged. Careers launched, reputations cemented. But now, as the evening hours stretched on, the hall sat nearly empty. Eleanor played the opening notes of her composition, her heart pounding so loudly, she wondered if it might be heard from the stage. The sound of the magnificent grand piano was unlike anything she had experienced before, rich and resonant, carrying each note to the farthest corners of the hall with perfect clarity. It was like finally speaking in her true voice after whispering for decades. In the front row, the 3 judges maintained their professional composure. The woman on the left, Dr. Harriet Chen, a renowned pianist herself, tilted her head slightly. The middle judge, an older gentleman with thick glasses, glanced up from his evaluation sheet. The third judge continued writing, his expression unchanged. Off to the side, Alessandro Rossi shifted in his chair. The legendary conductor had heard thousands of performances in his career. He had discovered some of the greatest talents of the past 20 years, conducted orchestras in every major city in the world. Today had been long, the talent mostly predictable, technically proficient but lacking something essential. He checked his watch again. Dinner reservations at 8. Just get through this last one. As Eleanor's piece moved into its second movement, something began to change in the nearly deserted hall. A staff member who had been collecting programs from empty seats paused, then quietly sat down in the back row. A photographer packing up his equipment by the side door lowered his camera bag and leaned against the wall, listening. The music itself seemed to transform the space. What had begun as a simple, elegant melody was unfolding into something more complex. Eleanor's hands moved with increasing confidence, coaxing from the piano a story told in notes instead of words, a story of loss and longing, of dreams deferred but not forgotten. Alessandro Rossi put down his pen. There was something unusual happening here, something he hadn't expected from the unremarkable-looking woman in the simple blue dress. The composition itself was unlike anything on the program today, not showy, or technically difficult for difficulty's sake, but layered with emotion that felt genuine, not performed. In her mind, Eleanor was no longer in the grand hall. She was back in her small apartment playing for her mother on those good days between hospital stays. She was in her childhood living room, her mother smiling from the armchair by the window. She was in all the small rooms where she had taught children to love music, passing on the gift that had sustained her through her hardest times. The judges exchanged glances. Dr. Chen made a small notation on her sheet, then set her pen down to listen without distraction. The older gentleman removed his glasses and closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him without visual input. In the back of the hall, the heavy door opened. A group of 4 people who had been heading to the exit returned, drawn by what they heard drifting into the lobby. They slipped into seats in the back row, unwilling to disturb the performance but unable to leave. Eleanor was deep in the heart of her composition now, the part she had written during the darkest days of her mother's illness. The notes grew more intense, occasionally dissonant, capturing the feeling of fighting against inevitable loss. Her left hand created a steady rhythm like a heartbeat, while her right wove a melody that seemed to be reaching for something just beyond grasp. A custodian pushing a cleaning cart in the hallway outside stopped, propped the door open with his foot, and stood listening, transfixed. Alessandro Rossi leaned forward in his chair. Without taking his eyes off the performer, he motioned to his assistant, who had been scrolling through messages on her phone. The young woman looked up, startled by her boss's sudden intensity. He gestured toward Eleanor, mouthing a question. "Who is she?" The assistant flipped through papers on her clipboard, then shrugged slightly. "Just another unknown." The composition moved into its final section. Here, Eleanor had poured everything. She had learned about grief and healing, about finding beauty in unexpected places. The melody became simpler but somehow deeper, like clear water that reveals its true depth only when you try to reach the bottom. In the wings, 2 stagehands who normally chatted through performances stood in respectful silence. One wiped a tear from her cheek, embarrassed but unable to help herself. Dr. Chen, unable to maintain her professional distance any longer, closed her eyes. The music had tapped into something she recognized from her own life, the bittersweet feeling of looking back on the path not taken, of wondering what might have been while accepting what is. As the piece approached its conclusion, Eleanor finally opened her eyes. She was surprised to find tears streaming down her face. She hadn't cried while playing since her mother's funeral, where she had sat alone at the church piano afterward, everyone else gone, and played this very piece for the first time from beginning to end. She was even more surprised to see that the hall was no longer as empty as when she had begun. People stood along the back wall. The remaining judges were completely still, their evaluation sheets forgotten, and Alessandro Rossi was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Surprise certainly, but something else too. Recognition perhaps of what she had carried within her all these years. The final notes hung in the air like a question left unanswered, then slowly faded into silence. For one terrible moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Eleanor's hands rested on the keys, her heart still racing, suddenly afraid she had embarrassed herself. Then Alessandro Rossi stood up. In all his years of judging competitions, attending concerts, discovering new talent, he had developed a reputation for being hard to impress. Musicians joked that making Rossi smile was more difficult than playing Rachmaninoff blindfolded. Yet here he was, not just standing but applauding, alone at first, then joined by the judges, then by everyone in the hall. "Brava!" called a voice from the back. Eleanor stood, unsure what to do. No one had prepared her for this. She had expected to plate a polite, disinterested evaluation, then go home to her empty apartment and return to her quiet life. Her promise to her mother fulfilled. Instead, Alessandro Rossi was walking toward the stage, something urgent in his expression. "The composition," he said, his Italian accent more pronounced with emotion. "It's extraordinary. Who wrote it?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "I did." His eyebrows shot up. "You?" She nodded, suddenly afraid she had broken some unspoken rule. "Is that not allowed?" The application said original compositions were acceptable. "Not allowed?" Rossi laughed, a warm, genuine sound that echoed through the hall. "My dear lady, it's more than allowed. It's—" He seemed to search for the right word. "It's what we hope for but rarely find. Something authentic. Something true." Dr. Chen approached, her professional demeanor softened by genuine curiosity. "How long have you been composing?" Eleanor thought about the notebooks filled with music that no one had ever heard, tucked away in drawers and boxes in her apartment. "All my life, I suppose, but only for myself." "Until today," Rossi said. "Until today," Eleanor agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. The third judge, who had been writing continuously throughout her performance, finally looked up. "We have 10 minutes before the next event needs this space. Ms. Martin, would you be willing to tell us more about your background? This piece suggests formal training, yet your application indicates—" "No formal training beyond childhood lessons," Eleanor confirmed. "I've been teaching piano for almost 20 years. My students are mostly children." "And this piece?" Dr. Chen asked. "What is it called?" "Memories of Daylight," Eleanor replied. "I wrote it for my mother. She passed away 3 months ago." A look of understanding passed between the judges. The music's emotional power made sense now. It came from somewhere real, somewhere lived. "Ms. Martin," Rossi said, his voice dropping to a more private tone despite the listeners nearby. "Would you have a moment to speak with me after you've finished with the judges? I have a proposition that might interest you." Eleanor nodded, feeling like she was in a dream. This morning she had been a middle-aged piano teacher from a small town that no one had ever heard of. She had come to fulfill a promise, to honor her mother's memory by sharing her music just once. She had expected nothing more than the chance to play in this beautiful hall, even if no one was really listening. Now, Alessandro Rossi, whose recordings she had collected and studied for years, wanted to speak with her. The judges were looking at her with new interest. People she didn't know were approaching to congratulate her. As she gathered her music sheets with trembling hands, Eleanor realized something that made her smile through her tears. Somewhere, somehow, her mother had known this would happen. That last good day when she had made Eleanor promise to enter this competition, she had known her daughter's music couldn't remain hidden forever. "You were right, Mom," she whispered, clutching her composition to her chest. "You were right all along." Eleanor followed Alessandro Rossi through the backstage area of the Westfield Music Center, still clutching her music sheets to her chest like a shield. Staff members nodded respectfully as the famous conductor passed, their curious glances lingering on the plain-looking woman trailing behind him. Who was she? Why had Rossi canceled his dinner plans to speak with her? "In here," Rossi said, holding open the door to a small meeting room. "We can talk privately." The room was simple but elegant, a polished table surrounded by comfortable chairs, framed photos of famous musicians lining the walls. Eleanor recognized faces she had only ever seen on album covers and in music magazines. "Please sit." Rossi gestured to a chair. "Would you like some water? Tea, perhaps?" "Water would be nice," Eleanor said, her throat dry from nerves. Rossi poured 2 glasses from a pitcher on the sideboard, then sat across from her, studying her with intelligent eyes. "I've been conducting and judging competitions for over 30 years, he began, his accent giving his words a musical quality. "In that time, I've heard thousands of pianists, some technically perfect, some with great passion, some with both. But what you did tonight was something different." He leaned forward. "Where have you been hiding?" Eleanor smiled nervously. "Ohio." Rossi laughed, a warm, genuine sound. Ohio. Well, Ohio has been keeping a treasure from the rest of us. He took a sip of water. Tell me about your composition. How long did it take you to write it? Eleanor thought for a moment. In one way, my whole life. The ideas, the feelings, they've been with me for years. But I only put it on paper over the last 6 months after my mother got sick. And no formal training in composition? She shook her head. I studied piano until I was 13, then life happened. I've taught myself from books and recordings since then. Remarkable, Rossi murmured. Your technical skill is impressive considering your background, but it's your compositional voice that interests me most. It's authentic, fresh. You haven't been, how do you say it, corrupted by too many teachers telling you what music should be. Eleanor looked down at her hands, worker's hands with short nails, and a small burn on one finger from her oven at home. Not a concert pianist's hands, not a composer's hands, or so she had always thought. Ms. Martin, Eleanor, I don't believe in wasting time. I'd like to feature your composition in the festival's closing ceremony 3 days from now. Eleanor's head snapped up. What? The closing ceremony features selections from the competition's most noteworthy performances. Usually these are interpreted pieces, Chopin, Beethoven, Rachmaninoff. But this year I want to include your original work. You would perform it yourself, of course. The room seemed to tilt slightly. But I didn't win the competition. Rossi waved his hand dismissively. The judges are still deliberating, but regardless of their decision as artistic director, I have discretion over the closing ceremony program, and I want your piece. I don't understand, Eleanor said slowly. There were so many talented musicians today. Professional musicians? Yes, and many of them played very well. Rossi leaned back in his chair. But they played what others have written, what has been played thousands of times before. You created something new, he smiled. Do you know what is rare in music today, Eleanor? Surprise, real surprise. Not clever tricks or strange techniques, but music that makes listeners feel something unexpected. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young woman with a clipboard poked her head in. I'm sorry, Maestro, but Dr. Chen asked me to give you this. She handed him a folded note. Rossi read it quickly, then smiled. It seems the judges have reached their decisions. He looked at Eleanor. No matter what this says, my offer stands. But let's see. He unfolded the note fully and scanned its contents. His eyebrows rose and he chuckled softly. Well, it seems I'm not the only one who was moved by your performance. He handed her the note. Congratulations, Eleanor. You've been awarded honorable mention. Eleanor read the note with disbelief. Honorable mention wasn't a win, but at her age, with no formal training, competing against world-class musicians. It was miraculous. I never expected. And there's more, Rossi said, tapping the note. Dr. Chen has requested a copy of your score for the conservatory's library. That's quite unusual. Eleanor felt tears threatening again. She took a deep breath to steady herself. So will you accept my offer? Will you play at the closing ceremony? Yes, Eleanor heard herself say. Yes, I will. Rossi clapped his hands together once decisively. Excellent. Now we have work to do. The ceremony will have a full orchestra. I'd like to arrange your piece for piano and orchestra. Would you be open to that? Orchestra? Eleanor felt dizzy. You want to arrange my piece for an orchestra? Just a small one, Rossi said, as if this were a minor detail. Strings, perhaps a few woodwinds. Your piano would still be the star. The next 2 hours passed in a blur. Rossi called in his assistant and a young composer who worked with the festival. They made copies of Eleanor's handwritten score, discussed passages that would benefit from orchestral accompaniment, debated tempo and dynamics. Eleanor found herself explaining her intentions behind certain sections, surprised by how clearly she could articulate what she had been trying to express through the music. It was nearly midnight when they finished. Eleanor's head was spinning with all that had happened, from the plain, overlooked woman given the last slot of the day to someone whose music would be featured in the festival's prestigious closing ceremony. My assistant will arrange your hotel stay for the next 3 days, Rossi said as they prepared to leave. We'll rehearse tomorrow afternoon. Hotel? But I only booked 1 night. My things you all taken care of. The festival will cover everything. He smiled at her bewildered expression. This is how it works in the music world, Eleanor. When something special happens, we move quickly. Outside, the night air was cool against Eleanor's flushed face. She stood on the steps of the Westfield Music Center, watching as Rossi climbed into a waiting car, waving as it pulled away. The streets were quiet now. The day's excitement settled into a peaceful stillness. She pulled out her phone to call her neighbor, who had promised to feed her cat during her overnight stay. The woman answered groggily, "Betty, I'm so sorry to call so late. Something's happened. I need to stay in the city for a few more days. Could you possibly check on Molly until Thursday?" As Eleanor explained the day's events, her own voice sounded strange to her ears, breathless, younger somehow. When she hung up, she stood for a long moment looking up at the stars, barely visible through the city lights, but brighter than they had seemed that morning. The next 3 days were like nothing Eleanor had ever experienced. Mornings were spent working with Rossi and the composer, refining the orchestral arrangement of Memories of Daylight. Afternoons were devoted to rehearsals with the small chamber orchestra assembled for the closing ceremony. At first, Eleanor felt hopelessly out of place among the professional musicians. They all seemed to speak a language of musical shorthand she only partially understood. But when she sat at the piano and played, something shifted. Her music became the common tongue they all shared. The concertmaster, a stern-looking woman with silver-streaked hair, approached her after the first full rehearsal. "Your piece is beautiful," she said simply. "It reminds me of why I became a musician in the first place." Each rehearsal brought new discoveries. Hearing her melody carried by violins, the counterpoint echoed by cellos, the harmonic foundation strengthened by violas. It was like watching a pencil sketch transform into a full-color painting. Her private expressions of grief and hope were being given new dimensions she had never imagined. In the evenings, Eleanor found herself invited to dinners with festival organizers, critics, and other musicians. People asked about her background, her influences, her process. At first, she felt like an imposter, a small-town piano teacher pretending to be a composer. But gradually, as she spoke about her music and heard others' genuine responses to it, something changed inside her. On the morning of the closing ceremony, Eleanor woke early in her hotel room. Sunlight streamed through the curtains she had forgotten to close. For a moment, she wasn't sure where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The competition, Rossi, the rehearsals, the orchestra, tonight's performance. She sat up and reached for her phone on the nightstand. There were texts from several of her piano students who had heard the news. Their humble teacher was performing at the Westfield Festival's closing ceremony. Local news from home had picked up the story. Her neighbor Betty had sent a photo of Molly the cat sitting in the window, apparently waiting for her return. And there was one voicemail from a number she didn't recognize. Eleanor played it, holding the phone to her ear. "Ms. Martin, this is Philip Cartwright from Meridian Records. I was at your performance on Monday, and I've also attended the rehearsals for the closing ceremony. I'd very much like to speak with you about recording your composition and perhaps discussing other works you may have. Please call me at your convenience." Eleanor lowered the phone slowly, staring at it as if it might explain what was happening to her life. A recording. They wanted to record her music. She moved to the window and pushed the curtains fully open, looking out at the city waking up below. Somewhere out there, people were buying tickets to hear her play tonight. Professional musicians were preparing to accompany her composition. A record executive wanted to meet with her. And for the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that perhaps her mother had been right all along. Perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps this wasn't just a lovely moment that would fade away when she returned to her small apartment and her students and her quiet life. Perhaps this was just the beginning. The Westfield Music Center's grand hall was filled to capacity for the closing ceremony. Every seat taken, people standing along the walls, an energy of anticipation buzzing through the crowd. Unlike the nearly empty hall where Eleanor had first played, tonight's audience included critics from major newspapers, representatives from recording companies, musicians, and music lovers who had heard rumors about a remarkable discovery at this year's festival. Backstage, Eleanor peeked through the curtain at the gathering crowd, her heart pounding. The black dress she wore, hastily purchased yesterday at a department store with the help of Rossi's assistant, felt foreign against her skin. For 20 years, she had worn simple clothes suitable for teaching children to play twinkle. Twinkle, little star. Now she was dressed for a concert stage, her hair styled, her sensible shoes replaced with something more elegant. Nervous, Alessandro Rossi appeared beside her, already in his conductor's attire. Terrified, Eleanor admitted. Rossi smiled. Good. The day you stop feeling nervous before a performance is the day you should stop performing. He patted her shoulder gently. Remember, they are already on your side. The story has spread. The unknown piano teacher whose music moved even the most hardened critics. They want to be part of this moment. The program had been carefully arranged. First, the winners of the competition would perform their pieces. Building to the grand finale, Eleanor's Memories of Daylight for piano and chamber orchestra, conducted by Rossi himself with the composer as soloist. Eleanor watched from the wings as the third-place winner played Liszt with technical brilliance. The second-place winner offered a haunting interpretation of Debussy, and the first-place winner dazzled with Rachmaninoff. All were young. All had been training since childhood. All had competed in dozens of festivals before this one. Their futures in music had been carefully planned and nurtured, and then it was her turn. Ladies and gentlemen, Rossi addressed the audience. Tonight we close our festival with something special. Music is not merely about technical skill or faithful interpretation of the masters. At its heart, music is about communication, one human spirit reaching out to another through the language of sound. Once in a great while we encounter a new voice that speaks with rare authenticity. He gestured toward the wings. Please welcome to the stage Eleanor Martin, performing her original composition, Memories of Daylight, in its world premiere arrangement for piano and chamber orchestra. The applause was warm as Eleanor walked onto the stage. She made her way to the grand piano, adjusted the bench and looked up at Rossi, who gave her an encouraging nod. Behind him, 20 musicians from the orchestra sat ready, their instruments poised. Eleanor placed her hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play the opening notes of her composition. Just as she had in the nearly empty hall days before, she closed her eyes and let the music flow through her. But this time, something magical happened as the orchestra joined in. The violins echoed her melody, adding depth and texture. Cellos provided a foundation that seemed to lift her piano line into the air. Woodwinds added colors she had never imagined when composing alone in her small apartment. Her private expression of grief and love and hope had transformed into something larger, something that filled the entire hall. She could feel the audience leaning forward in their seats, drawn into the story her music was telling, not just her story now, but a universal one of dreams deferred, of loss and resilience, of beauty found in unexpected places. As the piece built toward its climax, Eleanor opened her eyes. Rossi was conducting with his whole body, drawing from the orchestra exactly what the music needed. The musicians were fully engaged, not just playing notes on a page, but truly communicating the emotion behind them. And the audience sat in rapt attention, some with eyes closed, some with tears streaming down their faces. In that moment, Eleanor understood what her mother had known all along, that her music wasn't meant to stay hidden, that the very experiences that had kept her from a traditional musical career had given her something valuable to say. The final section of the piece, which she had written in the days after her mother's funeral, flowed from her fingers with new meaning. It was still about grief, yes, but also about transformation, about finding new beginnings when you least expect them. The orchestra swelled around her piano, supporting but never overwhelming it, until the final notes hung in the air like a benediction. Silence. And then the applause began, first a few hands, then more, building into a thunderous standing ovation that seemed to shake the very walls of the hall. "Brava!" called voices from different corners of the room. Rossi turned to Eleanor, gesturing for her to stand and acknowledge the audience. She rose on shaky legs, overwhelmed by the response. The applause continued, wave after wave of it washing over her. Rossi handed her a single white rose, then stepped back, giving her this moment entirely. The orchestra members tapped their bows against their music stands in their own sign of appreciation. As Eleanor looked out at the sea of faces, all focused on her, all moved by what she had created, she thought of the little girl who had once played on her grandmother's yellowed piano keys, of the teenager who had packed away her dreams, of the woman who had taught others while keeping her own music private. All of those versions of herself had led to this moment. The applause finally began to fade. Eleanor took one final bow and walked off stage on unsteady legs. In the wings, people waited to congratulate her. Festival organizers, other musicians, critics clutching programs they hoped she would sign. Among them stood a tall, distinguished man in a well-cut suit. He stepped forward, hand extended. "Ms. Martin, Philip Cartwright from Meridian Records. That was extraordinary. I'd like to discuss recording your composition as soon as possible, and exploring what other works you might have ready." Eleanor shook his hand, still dazed. "I have notebooks full of pieces no one has ever heard." His eyes lit up. "Then we have much to talk about." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind. Eleanor returned home to her small apartment and her cat Molly, but nothing was the same. Local newspapers ran stories about her. Former students called to congratulate her. The music store where she taught held a small reception in her honor. Philip Cartwright flew in from New York to spend 2 days going through her compositions. He sat at her modest, upright piano while she served coffee in her tiny living room, playing through pieces she had written over the years and tucked away in drawers. "This is remarkable," he said after the first day. "Most composers spend years finding their voice. You've developed yours in isolation, and it's completely unique." He shuffled through the pages of music. "We'd like to record an entire album. Your piano works first, then perhaps some chamber pieces if the first release does well." "An album?" Eleanor repeated, the idea still strange to her. "Of my music. The first of many, I hope," Philip said. He was right. The recording of Memories of Daylight was released 3 months later. First as a single and then as part of a full album titled Hidden Years. Critics described her music as refreshingly direct, emotionally truthful, and free from the academic constraints that weigh down so many contemporary composers. The album sold modestly at first, then gained momentum as it was discovered by listeners hungry for something authentic in a world of carefully manufactured sounds. A public radio feature on Eleanor's unusual path to recognition brought wider attention. Emails began arriving from people who had been moved by her music. People who had also set aside dreams, who had experienced loss, who found in her compositions a voice for feelings they couldn't express. 6 months after the Westfield Festival, Alessandro Rossi invited Eleanor to compose a piece for his orchestra's upcoming season. Around the same time, the director of a small ballet company asked permission to choreograph a dance to Memories of Daylight. Eleanor continued teaching at the music store, but reduced her hours to make time for composition. Her students now looked at her differently, not just as the kind lady who helped them with their scales, but as a real composer whose music people paid to hear. On the anniversary of her mother's passing, Eleanor visited the cemetery, bringing fresh flowers and a copy of her album. She sat on the small bench beside the grave, the early spring sun warm on her face. "You were right, Mom," she said softly. "It wasn't too late. It's never too late." That evening she gave her first solo recital in her hometown. The community center wasn't Carnegie Hall. The acoustics were mediocre. The piano had seen better days, and the folding chairs squeaked whenever anyone moved. But every seat was filled with people standing along the walls just as they had at the Westfield closing ceremony. Eleanor walked onto the small stage wearing a simple blue dress, not so different from the one she had worn to the competition a year ago. She adjusted the bench, looked out at the familiar faces, her students and their parents, neighbors, old friends, new supporters, and began to play. The piece was new, composed over the past few months. She called it Late Blooming, and into it she had poured all the joy and wonder of this unexpected chapter in her life. As she played, she felt completely present, completely herself, not a late discovery, not an unlikely success story, just a woman who had finally found the courage to share her voice with the world. And it turned out the world had been waiting to hear exactly what she had to say. In music classrooms and conservatories, Eleanor's story became a powerful reminder that talent doesn't always follow the expected path, that some voices develop in silence before emerging fully formed. Young musicians were encouraged to find their authentic expression, rather than merely mastering technique. Older music lovers were inspired to revisit abandoned instruments, to join community orchestras, to take lessons they had put off for someday. Eleanor never became a household name or a celebrity. She didn't sell out massive concert halls or win prestigious international awards, But her music touched people deeply, creating a loyal following that grew steadily over the years. Letters arrived from around the world, often beginning with the same phrase, "Your music found me exactly when I needed it." 10 years after that life-changing evening at the Westfield Festival, Eleanor sat at her piano, a beautiful grand that now filled most of her living room.